Hi, welcome to the seventh domain of CCSK. We are going to talk about the cloud infrastructure security in this domain. This is important domain and 6 questions are expected in the exam from this domain. Watch this video till the end to practice CCSK questions at the end of the video. If this is the first time you're watching my videos, don't forget to subscribe my channel. Cloud management plane. The infrastructure security is the foundation for the operational security in the cloud. The infrastructure is the glue between the computers underlying and the networks that we build everything on top of. The scope of the infrastructure security is the lowest layer of the security from physical facilities through the consumer's configuration and the implementation of the infrastructure components. Two aspects to the infra security. One is the cloud consideration for the underlying infrastructure, and second is the security for the virtual network and the workloads on top of that. There are two macro layers here. One is the consideration for the underlying infrastructure, that is the fundamental resource pooled together to create a cloud. This is, for example, the raw and physical and logical compute networks and storage that are used to build the cloud's resource pool. For example, this includes the security of the networking hardware and the software used to create the network resource pool. Number two is the virtualized or the abstracted infrastructure that is managed by the cloud customer itself. That's the compute network and storage asset that they use from the resource pool. For example, the security of the virtual network as defined and managed by the cloud user or the cloud customer, because they need to adhere with the organization policies and their obligations to follow. Cloud network virtualization. So three different networks in the management plane, we can say. All cloud utilizes some form of the virtual networking to abstract the physical network and to create a network resource pool. For example, some cloud platforms only support the allocation of the IP addresses within the particular subnet, while others allows the cloud user the capability to provision entire class B virtual network. If you are a cloud provider, and that includes even including the private cloud, and the physical segregation of the network composing your cloud is important for both the operational as well as the security reasons. Um, there are three networks here when we talk about the management plane security or the infrastructure security. The network virtualization has to happen at the three level, and if you talk about the network segregation, it is at the three different level: the management, storage, and the services. So management plane, these are the the APIs to manage to manage the management plane, the cloud management plane, that is dedicated network for managing the management plane of the cloud, because this is the highly virtualized environment which was supposed to be the wires, network, switches, routers, etc. at the end of the data center in the traditional IT environment. But here in the cloud, the management plane becomes more virtual and can be accessed through the APIs and the web UI, which has to be segregated on the separate network, which is known as the management network. Next is the storage network. This basically connects the storage network to the virtual machines. For example, the S3 buckets in AWS are connected to the nodes, to the dedicated cloud. That is for that purpose. And similarly, the services It is for the communication between the virtual machines and the internet. So two communications, instance to instance, if any VM to VM communication, and the internet to the compute node or to the instance. Cloud network virtualization, two kinds here, two major categories of the network virtualization commonly seen in the cloud, VLAN and SDN. So VLAN is very common in the enterprise network. Use is primarily being used in the single tenant, not designed for the cloud scale virtualization. Can be used in the cloud, but not very scale. If you need to keep the cloud scalable, then it is not designed for that. VLAN basically leverage the existing network technology implemented in the most network hardware, and virtual LANs are extremely common in the enterprises, even without the cloud computing. They are designed for use in the single tenant networks, to separate different business units, functions, etc. And VLANs are not designed for the cloud scale and virtualization. If you have to keep it virtual, then need to think of it. And they are also never a substitute for the physical network segregation. So that is the point that we need to remember. Software-defined networking, SDN, more complex, and the abstraction layer on top of the networking hardware. SDN decouples the network control plane from the data plane. Um, that is preferred for the cloud, because SDN, when we talk about the SDN, there are other security benefits we will talk about. These are very high in terms of the flexibility and the isolation. Security challenges or the security changes with the cloud networking. Um, it is not as same as we have in the traditional IT, but things are changing in the cloud networking. Lack of direct management of the underlying physical network changes. Commonly, network practices for the cloud user and the provider. And NIDS, for example, we used to have a dedicated NIDS in the traditional IT for a particular network, but here in the cloud it is changing now, because NIDS-like devices for intrusion detection, these devices are now integrated as part of the nodes and the virtual appliances, um, because these are the primarily challenges of the virtual appliances, that that takes the significant resources and the and increase the cost, because to run a virtual appliance, and if we have networking specific resources which are running as part of the virtual appliance, this will take significant resources of your cloud, and that will ultimately increase the cost. They becomes the bottleneck, of course. Should support auto scaling to support the elasticity. So if your virtual appliances are not supporting the auto scaling, then it will become another challenge to keep your cloud elastic. Cloud versatile, basically, this should support ability to move between the different geographic and zones. The velocity of change in the cloud is higher than the traditional infrastructure. So that's why we need to keep them more versatile. In terms of the application that are tend to be more distributed to improve the resiliency, here we have high rate of changes and frequent IP address changes, assets likely to sit on static IP. The high rate of changes, basically this induces that a very high rate of change that security tools must be able to manage. For example, servers with the lifespan of less than an hour. Um, it depends on the user. They may use for half an hour. They may use for 20 minutes, and then they can release the resources. That is the high rate of change. IP address, this is a frequent change. IP address will change far more quickly than on the traditional network, which the security tools must account for. Ideally, they should identify assets on the network by a unique ID, not an IP address or the network name. Assets are likely, less less likely. There's a typo. Assets are less likely, basically, to exist at the static IP address, because the cloud cannot afford to have a static IP for each and every resource in the cloud. Different assets may share the same IP address within the short period of time, because if one user is accessing the resource and after 15 minutes they release the resource, then things keep on changing, and things are very dynamic, so the IP addresses. And with this, we cannot rely much on the event loggings, because if the event logger talks about the IP address which was used for the person X, and after half an hour the same resource is being used, accessed by person Y, and with the same IP address, it is the difficult point how to handle that. So that is why this remains the challenge in the virtual appliances in the cloud. SDN security benefits. Isolation is easier if we use the SDN in the cloud. It becomes possible to build out as many isolated networks as you need without the constraints of the physical hardware. SDN firewalls. These are typically, the policies which are set, that defines ingress and egress rules. Ingress and egress are basically incoming and outgoing traffic that can apply to a single asset or the group of assets regardless of the network location. So wherever it is, for example, you can create a set of firewall rules that apply to any asset with a particular tag, and many network attacks are eliminated by default, such as ARP proofing, address resolution protocol proofing, and the other lower layer exploits beyond merely eliminating the sniffing. This is due to the inherent nature of the SDN and application for of more software-based rules and analysis in moving packets. The micro segmentation, the term basically, the segmentation and isolation, these are often used interchangeably in the cloud, but are very different things. In networking context, the segmentation refers to the partition a network into the smaller networks, basically the into the broadcast domains. Um, in a broadcast domain, all systems that are assigned to that VLAN will receive all the broadcast traffic, while the isolation, on the other hand, it restricts the communication to the intended destination machine only, as is the case in software-defined networking, SDN. The micro segmentation, also sometimes referred as the hyper segregation, that leverages the virtual network topologies to run more smaller and more isolated network without incurring additional hardware cost. Additional consideration basically for the cloud providers and for the hybrid clouds. So for the cloud providers or the private clouds, absolute critical to maintain the isolation and the segregation in the multi-tenant environment, because there might be n number of tenants or n number of customers sharing the same resources, sharing the same cloud. So it is very important, very critical to maintain the isolation and segregation in the multi-tenant environment. Provider must expose the security controls to the user. Every organization or the customer may have their own policies um, obligations, so they can define their security controls. They can impose accordingly. Providers are responsible for cloud security, cloud parameter security, because the in the cloud. Um, the physical data center and the physical hardware, it is in providers control, so they are more responsible for providing the cloud parameter security. um, while for the hybrid clouds, it is important to establish the basin or the transit network for more flexible hybrid cloud architecture, so that all not all the nodes are exposed directly to the external network. So workload security. So we have different type of workloads in the cloud, virtual machines, containers, and others. What is workload? It is a unit of processing which can be in a virtual machine, a container, or the other abstractions. Workload always runs somewhere on a processor and consume the memory. For example, in virtual machine, these are the most well-known form of the compute abstraction and are offered by all infrastructure as a service providers. They are commonly called the instances in the cloud computing, since they are created of a base image, because every they have a baseline of every image, and based on that baseline, for example, if the depending on the cloud provider, if the cloud provider having their own baselining, let's say X amount of, the X number of security requirements has to be there in the baseline image, and the X number of configurations has to be there by default in the baseline image. So that baseline image that is used to create the different instances in the cloud. Also, the cloud virtual machines are potentially open to certain memory attacks, but this is increasingly difficult due to the ongoing hardware and software enhancements to the reinforced isolation. Basically, the VMs on the modern hypervisors are generally an effective security control and advances in the hardware isolation for VMs. Containers are the code execution environment that runs within an operating system, sharing and leveraging the resources of that operating system. Platform-based workload, it is more complex category that covers workload running on a shared platform that are not virtual machine or a container, such as the logic or procedure running on a shared database platform. The serverless computing, there are serverless platforms for direct executing the application code under the hood. These still utilizes the capabilities such as containers and virtual machines or any specialized hardware platform. From a security perspective, the serverless is merely a combined term that covers the containers and platform-based workloads, where the cloud provider manage all the underlying layers, including foundational security functions and controls. Immutable workload security. You don't need to patch running systems or worry about the dependencies and broken patch processes. You can disable remote logins to run workloads. It is much faster to roll out the updated versions. It is easier to disable the services and whitelist applications or processes, since the instance should never change. Most security testing can be managed during the image creation, reducing need for the vulnerability assessment. So these are all, the immutable workload properties. Quick review. What we learned is the review compliance certifications and attestation of the provider. Prefer SDN over VLAN. In the cloud, implement deny by default with cloud firewalls. Apply firewall per workload basis rather than the network. So important point here, the firewall should be per workload, not per network, as we had in the traditional IT environment. Minimize dependency on virtual appliance. Leverage immutable workloads. Maintain security control for long running workloads. understand limitation on the vulnerability assessment and pen testing, because there is a limitation always in the cloud. You cannot perform the vulnerability assessment throughout the cloud, or you cannot perform the pen testing because that is the multi-tenant environment and different customers are using the same environment. So it is important to understand that limitation. IP address in logs won't necessarily reflect a particular workflow, because IP address highly in reuse in the cloud, because one node is used by someone, maybe released after 15 minutes, and after that may be used by someone else. So it won't be possible to reflect a particular workflow. Question time. For cloud providers, there are typically three different physical networks in a data center. Which of these is not of the typical network? So we discussed in the beginning of the slide that we have service, storage, and management, three types of the network. Virtual, this is the distractor. There is no such kind of network. So that is the right answer. Unlike physical networks, security appliances, firewalls in the SDN are typically free of charge, set to default, deny, not effective, broad in effect. We just discussed that it is the set to default deny. One of the benefit of microsegmentation is that each can exist on the same network. Um, Data center, of course not. Application, user, organization. Yes, application can exist on its own network, and that's the most prominent benefit of the micro segmentation in the cloud. How does a Bayesian or the transit network, virtual network architecture assist in a hybrid cloud deployment? Um, the Each second level network can only connect to the data center through the dedicated Bayesian or transit network or VPN, and therefore isolated from each other. The user are still able to reach to the cloud, but the Bayesian transit virtual network don't aid in preventing DOS, DDoS attack, nor in authentication. But um, the second level of network are not peered to each other, and therefore effectively segregated. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe my channel, like and share the videos with your colleague, whosoever is preparing for CCSK. You can comment for the questions and clarifications. Thank you.